Hey testers, Matt here with CheckView. One question we get asked quite often is, can you use CheckView for things other than testing forms and checkout? And the good news is you can. Essentially, if you're using a WordPress site and you have a test flow, there's a good chance that you can use our custom step editor in order to create those steps. So today I'm going to go over an example of how we can test a login using LearnDash, confirm we're logging in, and then confirm we're logging out properly. And this will also get you familiar with how to use the custom step editor instead of using our auto-generated tests. So let's get started. All right, so I've already set up a test site here. This is for a training company that sells accounting courses. This is just an example, but they want to test the login and the logout functionality to ensure their customers can log in, log out, and they don't have to worry or stress that people aren't able to log in and they're going to have to wait till someone reports it. Let's say updates go wrong or something like that. So I already have CheckView installed. I have a Cadence theme installed. So if I go over to CheckView here, I've already connected the website, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to click Add Test Flow. And it's not going to show any plugins or checkout that we support are installed, and that's okay because we're going to create a custom test flow. So I'm going to say start from scratch, which will let us create a custom test flow. And I'm going to say testing login and logout, since that's what we're going to test today. We don't really need to worry about the pop-ups and modals, but I'll leave that checked in case someone ever adds one. It's not going to break the tests. And we're going to say, yeah, 9 a.m. will work. I'm going to go ahead and click on Go to Step Editor. It's not going to run any sort of preview test because we need to write the steps. And now I'm going to get you guys familiar with how to use the custom step editor, which really lets you set up all sorts of tests exactly how you want. You just have to know a little bit about how to tell the bot what to click on and that sort of thing. So this is going to be a really good introduction for that. So I'm going to click Add New Step. And this is the sequential order that's going to allow our bot to run when it gets to the website. So there's going to be various actions that the bot can take, and this really lets the bot run through the test flow you want to test. What I recommend is visualizing this or thinking about this as if you're the user and what the steps are. So a lot of times when I write these steps, I like to have the website open here and actually walk through it step by step and confirm as I go through to make sure it's going to be set up properly. And then of course we'll test it. Now outside of the actions, which I'll go over in a minute, most of the time you're going to have some sort of parameters or values you need to enter to tell the bot additional instructions. For example, hey, I want to click here. You've got to tell it what CSS selector or XPath selector, essentially the way it can find that element on the page in order to click the right button or the right link, etc. And then you can see you can add new steps as you go, and they'll go in order. You can drag and drop as well. And sometimes there will be test variables available, and we're going to plan to expand that in the future. But right now, if we were using this to test an email, it would generate a dynamic email address from CheckView so that that email could get sent to us. That only works with our supported forms in Woo. But in the future, we do plan to add other dynamic things such as, today's date or that sort of thing, and generate a password, all sorts of options. So I'm going to go ahead and start with go to URL. This is the action that we're primarily going to always start with when you're creating a new test flow. You may use this more throughout a test, but most of the time it's just going to be right at the beginning because we need to tell it where to go. So we're going to say go to URL, and I'm just going to copy over the homepage URL because I want to start testing straight from the homepage. You could start from the login page, but I want to increase our test coverage a little bit and make sure the homepage is working. All right, I'm going to hit add new step now. Now this is where, as we look through the different actions, you can tell the bot to do things like pause. Let's say if you need to give the page more time to load on a slower site, or it's something that requires more effort and resources, refresh the page. Hover on like a mega menu. You can make assertions around emails and form submissions. That's primarily going to only be used for the supported forms that we have. You can press a specific key on the keyboard. You can assign a value to a field that's typically going to be like text fields or text area fields, which we will use today. You can click on a certain element. We're definitely going to use that today. You can uncheck or check a button. You can also select drop downs in like a form with specific values. Now, some of the most powerful ones is you can do assertions. And these are really important if you definitely want to make sure your test flow is working. Because for example, if I have it click through the whole test flow, it may be able to make it through all my fields, but it doesn't mean it's actually right. So we're going to use one of these assertions today, the assert element text contains, to confirm that the successful message appears. It's basically asserting, yes, I see that text on the page. And then the same thing when we go to log out. You could technically leave this out and it would likely be fine, but you may not get alerted every single time if, let's say, the bot's able to run through it, but the page breaks. We want to make sure that we're still testing as much as possible. You can also do that with things like, does a certain element show on the page? Is a certain element present, which means it's showing in the code, but maybe not necessarily visible to the user. So these are really powerful, and I recommend using assertions as well. We plan to add more options here for actions, but this should cover a majority of what you need to run, especially with today's flow that we're going to test. We already have the go to URL set up. The next thing we need to do is we need to click on the login button itself. So I'm going to switch over, and like I said, I'm going to go step by step here. And I want us to click the login to get the bot to our page. And that will also verify our login's working as far as the URL goes in the link. So I'm going to use Chrome Developer Tools and the Inspect tool to actually go in and find that login ID or selector that I think is going to be a good fit. And if you don't know how to use this, there's definitely tons of resources online. We also have some documentation on this. So by default, if I click that inspector tool and click login, it's going to take me right here to this A right here, this hyperlink. In it itself, if I copied this over, I could say copy selector, and this may give me a unique enough value that this works. Now, whenever you look at this, what I recommend doing is using IDs if at all possible. So if this A had an ID, that's what I would be using. It's going to be the most unique thing on the page and less likely to break when you're setting up tests in the future. Now, if that's not available, you can look for classes that are specific. So in this case, again, the A doesn't have a class that's specific, but if I look at the list item or the menu item above that it's nested in, I can see page-item-235, which is pretty unique. That's not likely to change unless someone goes in there and custom changes it. So I want to make sure if I use this copy selector here that it will actually pull the page item 235 as well as the A, because we don't just want to link to the list item, it needs to be on the link or the bot's not going to be able to click it. So I'm going to go ahead and switch back, and I'm just going to paste in what I copied for the selector. And you can see it's pretty specific. It's saying in the primary menu, find the list item with this ID and specifically that hyperlink. So this is perfect. This is going to be pretty unique and is unlikely to change. Now, if it had things like nested divs where it just said div, that sort of thing, those are likely to break. You want to make sure that, again, there's something more specific on the page. And there's a lot of good information on targeting the right selectors online, as well as some in our documentation. So at this point, I'm going to follow along. I'm going to click login here. It's going to take us to the login page. And this is actually where we're going to log in and confirm login's working. So I'm going to add a new step, and we're going to assume it's made it to this page. And the first thing we need to do is we need to enter a username. So that's where we're going to use the assign field. If you're using text or text areas, it's almost always going to be the assign field. And in addition now to actually telling it what element we need to target, we have to give it a value. So that's actually going to be our username and password. Now, one thing to keep in mind is it's highly recommended if you're going to use username and passwords that are not real credentials. They should be dummy credentials, and they should not have any sensitive data related to the account. Do not use real customer credentials, because when tests run in CheckView, there's no way to 100% secure that. In addition, if you can run this in staging, that's even better. But in this case, I've already created a test user account that has access to just one course. So we're actually going to go ahead and enter that. So I need to go back. I first need to find the selector that's going to allow us to find this field. So I just inspected it again, and I can see it gets an input. And you can see it has an ID of user_login, which is perfect. That's really what we're looking for. So if I go to copy that selector, I want to make sure that's what Chrome gets. I paste that in. It looks great. I already know my test user account, so I'm just going to type that in, test customer. And now we need to do the same thing for the password. So I'm going to go ahead and choose assign here. I'm going to inspect, and I can see user underscore password looks good. I'm going to copy that selector. And now we need to add in our password. All right, so we have our password there. So that looks good. Now, if we look back, the next thing we need to do is actually click the login button. So the bot needs to know how to do that. So I'm going to go back, add a step, and click is already set. So I'm just going to inspect. And it looks like it has a nice ID again, WP-submit. So I'm going to copy that selector. And that should allow us to log in. So I always like to practice this as I go. So I'm going to go ahead and put in that information. And I'm going to make sure that the login does work before I go forward with it. And I can see we get the login successful message. So now if I go back to CheckView, we know that we're logged in, and we want to actually confirm now that the verification message that login was successful shows. So this is where we're going to use an assertion, as I mentioned before, and we're going to look for, does the element contain? You can use equal as well. This is really good if you are familiar with regex. It will let you create really powerful dynamic checks. Let's say if shipping costs change, but they're within a certain range, you want to check for that, it can do that. But contains is definitely more flexible and usually what I recommend. So that way, if your message slightly changes for what have you, it's not going to break your test. So I'm going to say contains. And similar to our other ones, we need to give it a selector and a value that it's going to be looking for that text. So I'm going to go back to our page here, and in our inspector tools, I'm going to look for that message. And there is a class that's pretty specific on this. This is from Uncanny, which is what I'm using for this message. So if I copy that, let's see if that's pretty specific. And you can see it's not very specific. So this is a good example of where this is probably going to break because it's just using a bunch of divs. So we're not going to use that. We're going to have to do it on our own. And if you're not familiar with CSS, you may also look at using Selectors Hub, which is a free Chrome extension that will give you more options if you're not familiar with using CSS selectors. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just use this class on my own and look for this. And since I expect this class is only going to show up on this page one time, I can pretty accurately use it. So I'm going to put that in to look for that class. And we want to see if it contains a certain value. So login successful is what we're looking for. So there we go. We've got login successful. So it's actually going to check now, does that message appear? And if it doesn't, it's going to fail. And this is really good to add because, for example, in our previous step, we checked and it clicked to submit, but it's not really checking like, did login actually happen? And you could use something like the page title, for example, instead of this message. And sometimes you have to do that if there is no message. But this is definitely a lot more clear that login was successful than if just a page title shows up and maybe, the content's messed up or something's not right. Now, if I go back, the next thing I want to test is the logout button. It doesn't have an ID, but it does have somewhat generic class, just default link here, which is not great, to be honest, because if there were multiple uncanny default links, then this could click the wrong thing. Now I see it does have a title that it gives it for logout, so we might be able to use, so let's go ahead and create the step first. So I'm gonna go ahead and choose click again. And first, let's see what Chrome puts together for this copy selector option. So you can see, not very helpful, just a bunch of nested divs that are probably gonna break at some point. So let's try XPath and see what it puts together. And I hit copy XPath, which is an alternative to selectors instead of CSS. Again, not very helpful. It's actually pretty similar to what it put together before. So now let's switch things up and let's use Selectors Hub to see what they give us. Again, it's a free extension, and once you install it, there'll be its own inspect button here. And let's go ahead and click. and I can see it put together some options here. A CSS selector using the title as I expected it would, or an XPath selector. So either of these would work. Now, if you have a choice and you feel confident in your CSS selector, then I recommend using the CSS selector. XPath takes longer for CheckView to run for sure. It's more powerful, but it is easier, I think, to make mistakes if you're not familiar with it. So we're gonna use CSS. And this is making the assumption that this is the only link, really hyperlink, that has the title logout. But I think that's a safe assumption to make. So now we have that and it's good to go. So I'm gonna hit the logout button here and we're gonna see if there's anything else we need to verify here. So there's not a message in this case, which is a good example where there may not be a message for you to look for. So instead, what I'm gonna look for is the most specific information that I think is probably not gonna change. So I'm gonna try to use the login below to access your courses, because that's pretty much assuming that I was logged out or I wouldn't be seeing this. And again, I'm making an assumption here and you have to do what's comfortable. So I can see it has a login description and that should be good enough to use. So I'm gonna copy that selector and we're gonna do another assertion for contains. And again, by default, what it put together in Chrome was not helpful. So I'm gonna use the class that's more specific myself. I'm gonna go ahead and use the value here. And you may wanna make it less specific than this. That depends on you. It could create false positives, again, if someone changes this just slightly. So maybe I wanted to say login below, and that way if someone just changes a little bit, it's less likely to break. I'm already using contains. So that's gonna assert that we at least made it to the logout page. So now we have all our steps set up, logging in and logging out and confirming that it's working. So we're gonna hit save, and now we can actually go back and run a test. So let's see how we do. All right, so it just finished running through all the steps. You can see they all checked off, which means we did a good job here. Now, if you did get a red mark, definitely click on them and see, what the issue is. Typically, wherever it marked it is where the issue occurs, but sometimes it can be earlier in an earlier step. Double check your things like selectors. That's the most common reason custom tests don't work, is selectors or values were entered incorrectly. Now I can see it marked it as passed and it made a video. So again, if yours failed, definitely check out the video. That video will give you probably the best indicator of what's going on. Once a test has fully finished and even passed, I want to make sure and scrub through the data. So if I look at it, I can see it's filling through the username and password. After it got to the login page, shows the login successful, and then it made it to the logout page here. So it's doing exactly what we want. And if I go back, I can see that's now scheduled for 9 a.m. and we can feel confident that our login logout's working on this accounting courses site. And if any issues come up, we'll know as soon as possible. So I hope today's video was helpful in showing you that you can use CheckView for more than just testing forms and checkout like we have built in. You can use it for other types of forms, test flows, subscriptions, social networks, LearnDash courses, really anything out there. As long as it allows you to use WordPress with selectors, you can run through it. Now, if you get stuck or have any questions, definitely reach out to our support desk and we're happy to help. Catch you in the next video. Thanks so much.